Okay, we can probably go ahead and get started. So good evening, and thank you guys so much for joining us for Alumni in the Arts, Creating and Curating. We are pleased to welcome you to the third edition of panel discussions sponsored by the Museum Club. The Museum Club is a group of students from all different majors and backgrounds who share a common interest in art, visual culture, and museums. The group meets once a week and acts as a bridge between the museum and campus. If you'd like to learn more, please visit our page on the Hood Museum's website. So this evening, we are joined by two distinguished alumni who will speak about their careers as a curator and an artist. Mateo Romero, 89, Cochiti Pueblo painter and Dubin Fellow, and Medill Harvey, 90, Associate Curator of American Decorative Arts and manager of the Henry R. Luce Center for the Study of American Art at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. My name is Lucy Turnipseed. I'm a Dartmouth 22 and a member of the Alumni in the Arts Committee. I'm from Washington, D.C. and an art history major. I will be one of the moderators for our program and will be joined by two other student moderators, Abby and Jarett, who will be facilitating the prepared questions portion of the event.
Hey y'all, my name is Abby Smith and I'm a 23 from Macon, Georgia. I'm an art history major and a co-chair of the Museum Club's Alumni in the Arts Committee.
Hi folks, I'm Jarett Lewis, 21 from Oklahoma, and I'm studying studio art and economics. I'm also a co-chair of Museum Club's Alumni in the Arts Committee.
So before we begin, we have a few reminders. This evening's discussion will run for about an hour and consist of two sections. In the first section, Abby and Jarett will deliver a series of questions to the panelists. Then in the second part, I will field Q&A from the audience. So at any point during the event, please submit your questions via the Q&A feature on Zoom. We strongly encourage you to ask any questions you may have, and we'll do our best to get to as many as possible in the second half of the program. Please also note that this program is being recorded and we will share the link on the Hood Museum's social media platforms in the coming days. We're also providing Zoom's auto-generated captions. This is not a perfect service though, so please be aware that there are bound to be some translation errors. If you wish to turn them off, go to the live captions icon on your Zoom toolbar and select Hide Subtitles.
Now I'll ask our speakers to introduce themselves. Medill, would you like to share with us a little bit about your career and background?
Hi, it's nice to be here virtually with everybody. So in addition to having the world's longest title, basically I have long been a curator at the Met working with decorative arts, which just means the stuff that is made for us to live with and use in our lives, like silver, furniture, ceramics, etc. My focus is silver, metalwork, jewelry, and furniture. So I'm happy to say more, but I think we probably want to get to the meat of the matter.
Thank you, Medill. Our second panelist is Mateo Romero, a member of Dartmouth's class of '89. Mateo, would you mind giving us a quick introduction on your career and background?
Sure. I'm a Cochiti Pueblo tribal member. I'm a painter. I do figure ground stuff. I also do landscape, kind of expressionist landscape and oil. And I'm married to a Milwaukee tribal member, Luce Romero. And I'm actually in my studio here in Milwaukee, Pueblo at the Cultural Center. And I'm hoping that they're going to start up a little buffalo dance in the background. So if they do, I might pan over there really quick and show you the dance they're doing, because it's kind of cool.
Yeah, awesome.
Very cool. Well, thank you all so much for introducing yourselves. And now we'll move on to the prepared questions. So the first one is for Medill, or for both, I'm sorry, but we'll start with Medill. So the question is, how did your time at Dartmouth help shape or motivate your career path?
Well, I would say it all started at Dartmouth, as I had never studied art history before I arrived at Dartmouth. I had loved going to museums as a kid and had always really enjoyed history and found ways to sort of work art and material culture into history work that I did in high school, but had never studied art history until I got to Dartmouth. And so it started me on a path that I had never conceived of the decorative arts. It's not something that's typically taught in US universities, but I will say a formative experience was a seminar I took with a professor named Kathleen Corrigan. it turned out I was the only person in the seminar. So it became the two of us working on the Syrian floor mosaics, which are in the Hood's collection. And not only was it an opportunity to really sort of dive into the kind of research that I love, which is to read the archaeological reports and to start thinking about who made these, how they were used, what is the iconography telling us, et cetera, and really digging into primary sources, which is the kind of nerdy stuff I love to do. But it also gave me a chance to really connect with a professor who gave me the kinds of insights that I really wasn't able to have had without somebody on the outside. Like she said to me, you know, Medill, the kinds of questions you ask, you need to think when you go to graduate school about places that really are focused on social and cultural history. And honestly, maybe I was self-involved, but if I thought it was interesting, I figured everyone would think it was interesting. And really becoming more sort of intentional about the kinds of academic inquiry that interested me. And I think it really did lay the groundwork when I ended up being in a program in London where I was exposed to the decorative arts. All of that sort of allowed me to sort of be ready to recognize that what excited me about that was very much this telling stories about social and cultural history. And that was the beginning.
Well, thank you so much, Medill. Matteo, do you want to share next?
Sure. What was the question?
Oh, sure. How did your time at Dartmouth help shape or motivate your career path?
I was really fortunate when I was there. I loved my Dartmouth experience as a student, and I had two amazing instructors in studio art. And one was Ben Moss. He was a painter who'd recently come over from Iowa State, I think it was. And he was an extraordinary landscape painter, kind of a classical easel painter. And the other was Varejan Bogosian. And I think that they're both retired at this point, but they were pretty important to me when I was 18, 19 years old in very different ways. I think of them kind of like Captain Kirk and Mr. Spock from the old serial TV Star Trek. And, you know, Ben Moss was like the Mr. Spock. He was very analytical and very academic and very, you know, classically trained painter. And he was an easel painter, and everything was, you know, inside the frame, and everything fit. And it was all about rhythm and kind of a Renaissance sense of time and, you know, application, rhythm, color, surface. And Varejan Bogosian was really quixotic. I mean, he was kind of really out there. He was really wild, right? He was really eccentric, and he taught me a lot about just being an artist. But it was not at all the Ben Moss approach. It was not the analytical side. It was very emotional, and he was kind of he was a character. He was like something out of a T.S. Eliot novel, like a Sweeney or something, you know. And he would say things. He talked like this, you see, and he would say things. You'd come to class and you have an assignment. He'd look at the stuff and he'd just be like, this was a time when there's probably only 6 studio art majors, and we were in one building which is no longer there. They knocked the building down. They made something else out of it, and they just kind of let us loose. They just put us in this building. There were 6 of us, and they let us loose. And he would come in and look at the assignments, and if he didn't like what he saw, he would say things like, listen, I'm not going to talk about this stuff. What I want you to do is make a poem. You see, I want you to make a poem and come to the next meeting and recite the poem to me. And then he would give you like a book on Eliot or something. He would say, take this book. And he'd also say things like, you know, I'm giving you this book, not because of the work you've done, but just because I think you need this. So, and he loved T.C. Cannon. You know, T.C. Cannon was one of these like fellows there, right? Like Fritz Scholder and Cannon were there. And he would just say, he would get really morose, you know, like I think maybe he was like, he had some kind of morose thing about, I mean, he loved T.C. Cannon, but he would say things like, he was so beautiful, you see. T.C. Cannon was so beautiful. He had long hair and he played the guitar and he sang poetry, you see. Your assignment is to go home and make poetry for the next class. And it was kind of interesting, right? I mean, so there was this really eccentric point of view that, you know, art was not necessarily product. It was just this kind of experience, this kind of, you know, aesthetic experience And he was into that. I mean, his own work was really interesting, but really abstruse and really obscure and really personal and kind of funky and not clearly understood. And he loved that canon stuff. You know, he'd just go on about canon, and he had a shoulder. He had an amazing shoulder. I think he donated it to the museum for a tax write-off for the hood. I guess he didn't take shoulder so serious, but everyone just loved T.C. Cannon and still loves T.C. Cannon. Is that an answer? I don't know. That was my answer.
That works for me. Thank you. So the next question is, how do each of you, as an artist and curator, perceive the role of the other? And this is a question for both, but we'll start with Matteo, if that's all right.
You mean other like as in discourse, or do you mean other like an artist and a curator as others?
As others.
That's the question I'm asking.
Yeah. However,
like dichotomy, like an artist, like in a dichotomy with a curator. That's what you mean,
right?
Because people talk about other in discourse also. Like that's part of, you know, gender identity politic discourse. Interestingly enough, you know, I think I'm like 54, so I've been doing this pretty actively since I was 18. Artists need curators. Curators are a form of agency. Artists of themselves on their own are not a form of agency. Oftentimes, that sounds like a paradox. Like it sounds like it's like a contradiction. But we need curators, and we need them as a form of agency. They have all the access, the institutional access. They hold the keys to all the institutions. And my greatest hope is to be, you know, someone that a MFA or PhD curator is writing about in grad school, right? That's really what I want, because I have a theory that they do it like a graduate school dissertation, a PhD on like someone like Faye Heavyshield out of like First Nations Canada. And then you see all this Faye Heavyshield curation popping up for the next 15 or 20 years. So that's really my hope, is that someone will take me on as a pet project and start writing about like expressionist oil painting from the Southwest, and I'll become like embedded in some kind of institutional like discourse, right? And you know, and I love it when they're great. I mean, there's some amazing curators out there. I'm totally awed by some of the quality of the curators and what they can accomplish. These are artists themselves, and really the text of what they create and their curation sensibilities and their aesthetics is their art, you know. So I'm not someone who makes distinctions between high and low art. I know we have a craft curator on this panel today, and you know, as a Native person, we don't really differentiate high and low. We don't differentiate craft or you know, decorative work from fine art. We don't necessarily have embedded ideas about male and female gender associated with different styles of work. So I'm you know, I love it. I need more. I need someone to adopt me as a project and write me into the annals of art history, because oftentimes artists can't do it themselves. I mean, we make the work, and it's a largely solitary process. You know, we're in a studio, we're in this context, usually alone, and it comes to other people to sort of, you know, bring us out and put us into the institutional light. We do what we can. You know, artists, I think nowadays, are much more on Facebook and Instagram and using digital platforms and social media. So it has shifted in terms of, you know, 20 years ago, it was exclusively like a curation game. I mean, if you wanted to get a catalog published, it was almost entirely the provenance of people to kind of bring you into the institutions and sort of give you a budget and work with you. But now I see a movement away with digital platforms, but still I think largely with the more prestigious organizations, it is a curation game as a form of agency.
Thank you. And Medill?
Well, I agree. I think from my perspective, obviously I work with artists who are no longer around. So I'm feeling a great responsibility to recognize that I need to understand their voice, their intention, but then there also is all of this sort of analytical armature that Mateo is talking about, where you're bringing it into various different contexts. Sometimes the contexts are ones that living artists don't love, or artists who can no longer speak for themselves might not. But then at other times, when it works well, it's a dialogue that sort of brings different perspectives and sort of voice to the work. I mean, from my perspective, when you say, how do we see each other? I mean, I would say that most art historians become art historians because they're sort of in awe of artists and of that ability to make. When we were preparing for this, I was remembering that Dartmouth required art historians to take a couple of studio art classes, which was torture for me on the one hand, because I couldn't, what the professor I had said, Medill, you're drawing what you know. It's like, well, yeah, I'm really good at this sort of analytical stuff. And yet that I think Dartmouth really serves their art historians well, because I think you are a better agent for and collaborator with artists for at least having to try it. And at the same time, I think my colleagues who work with living artists, it's a very different kind of process. And at its best, it's collaborative, and you're learning from each other and pushing each other to think in different ways. And you know, there are times when that can be fraught if curators have one idea and an artist has another. I mean, obviously I work at a very big and bureaucratic institution, but artists will say, I don't want to be in those galleries. When we had the Breuer building, I don't want to be in the Breuer building. I want to be in the main building. And so it's that part of it can become more about diplomacy than about the reason we're all doing this, which is to share in each other's love of art and art making.
Well, thank you all. Those are great answers. Our next question is for Medill. What's the process of curating an exhibit like? You already kind of talked about the diplomacy, but can you like walk us through the thing?
Gosh, every exhibition is totally its own animal. And again, living artists versus, I mean, I'm doing historical stuff. So for me, exhibitions start with an idea that has to be sort of pitched to a whole bunch of internal constituents. So I sit down with panels of curators who ask me questions to sort of determine, does this story need to be told? Are you asking the right questions, et cetera, et cetera. And then when you get the green light to explore your idea, it's years of research. Whenever I talk to friends who work in other industries, they'll say, wait, you're still doing the same thing? It takes a really, really long time. And then the fun is once you have decided what the sort of the ideas that you're sharing and the work, and choosing the work is the really fun part. And some of that is as you as a curator learn more, you refine a list, and then there's the practical realities of what can you get, who will loan what, and then there's a lot of negotiating. I mean, by the time I send out a loan letter, I've talked to everybody who owns these works about why this given work is important for my project, and sort of you don't ask until you kind of know what the answer is, but there always are surprises along the way. And then there is the process of collaborating with so many gifted people in the institution who help you design the show, design the lighting, the graphic designers. Like, really, that's a huge sort of 50% of it is once my ideas are baked, it's the what does that look like in the space. And I feel like for the kind of things I work on, where there might be certain barriers to entry in terms of, why do I care about this? Why do I want to look at this show? Designing it so that it makes sense. I mean, I spent a lot of time writing a lot of text, but I feel like shows have to work without any text. So I'm indebted to amazing exhibition designers and lighting designers who help bring that all together. So I don't know if that's responsive, and I don't want to go on too long.
Thank you. That was a great response. And Mateo, I'd like to turn it to you and ask a little bit about your creative process, and maybe if it varies for certain shows or exhibitions, or if you have kind of a consistent way of coming up with pieces.
I used to light paint at the Oakland Art Museum. I was a preparator when I was a Dartmouth kid. And I would go in and they would let me do some of the light painting, some of the wall prep. And we would turn off all the lights during lunch and we would feel the Nathan Oliveras and the Diebenkorn paintings and touch them. And we'd run our lips over the fingertips. It was really bad boy stuff. It was kind of like naughty. I guess they didn't know. We'd key ourselves in. And when you touch the Thibault paintings, like you touch a delicatessen painting by Thibault or an ice cream painting, it's got this real tactile feeling. And you kind of run your lips over the surface and you can actually feel like the sardines, you can feel like the spoons and everything. I don't know if that's not really related to the question, but I just had to throw that in because the light painting thing was so interesting to me. I used to be a preparator. I still light paint. I still do light painting. What was the question again?
What is your creative process in coming up with new pieces, and does that change for different shows or exhibitions?
I've been doing a lot of landscape, and the landscape, the process is, there's several levels to it. One of the parts of it, which I really enjoy, is just walking in the landscape. And I walk in the landscapes. I do a lot of hiking around Ghost Ranch and Abiquiu. It's all northern New Mexico stuff. And it's got these really amazing colors. It's O'Keeffe stuff. It's El Pedernal and Ghost Ranch. It's those amazing primary colors that occur really only in northern New Mexico. It's like cadmium yellows and cadmium orange, cadmium red, iron oxides, burnt siennas. There's a really interesting color sensibility that comes out of this space with a lot of vertical and kind of horizontal, kind of truncated geography and stratigraphy in the landscape. So I hike that, and then I do some photography out there. I take some notes. I do a little sketching, and I also do some reading. I read about a lot about the indigenous space here. So embedded in some of the works I do and some of the titles of the paintings I do are the original Tewa and Carrie's names from the Rio Grande Pueblo people. So O'Keeffe is really famous for doing El Pedernal, for instance, but El Pedernal and Tewa is actually Tsipingawinge, and that's the pre-existing indigenous name before Spanish contact, before the colonizers show up. And Tsiping is Flint Mountain. Tsi is Flint, Ing is mountain, Awinge is village of. It's a suffix that connotates there's a village there. And there's actually a ruin in El Pedernal. So that there is actually a Pueblo historic ruin in the space, the skirting of the mesa of El Pedernal has a village ruin there. And then I take that information back and I kind of ruminate on it. And, I do a lot of, petroglyph hiking and sketching and just the etymologies of the words and the places, all these spaces. I'm in Pewaukee here, and Pewaukee is, today I'm in Pewaukee in my studio, and the drums just started. Can you hear that? Do you guys hear the buffalo drums? They're probably dancing. Should I walk out there and show you the buffalo dance, or is that kind of off topic for what we're doing?
It'd be awesome.
You want to see the dance? I'll see if they're doing it. They're probably doing it out there. The point I was trying to make is that, yeah, they're dancing. You'll hear them out there. Can you hear it?
Yeah, I can hear it now.
That's how interesting it is, right? So I basically take this, which is living culture, and I try to imbue it into figure ground painting and also into landscape painting. So it's a big task. Embedded in this painting are these ideas about culture and space, and I think the most interesting idea probably is that in Tewa culture, that the landscape is considered alive. It's not an animism concept. It's actually an unique kind of indigenous concept. And people are sort of considered to be extensions of the landscape in that respect. People are alive in the landscape. The landscape is alive. The songs are alive, the names and places, the wind, the rain. It sounds very romantic, but it's actually real. I mean, if you're here in the space and you do the dances and you walk in the spaces and you know the names of the places, this stuff is all embedded in the work in a kind of way, a form. It's hard to explain with words, but in the form of the color and the brush strokes and the palette knife marks, I'm hoping to capture this kind of essence of indigeneity in the work, I guess. So it's kind of a lived experience. It's not really a process of making the work as much as it is being here and just being open and taking the information in. And then, I just paint. After that, I just paint. I just make paintings. I look at compositions, I look at sketches. I listen to music when I work. And I guess that's the ideology. The underlying ideology is just about people and space and energy and migration and indigenous thought, indigenous language, which is actually, I mean, in essence, it starts out in very, a very specific kind of, contemporary native kind of feel, but really they're just human conditions. I mean, it's that kind of, the human condition, really. It's the human placement in the landscape. It's the human relationship to space and rain, clouds and light and snow and all this stuff. So I'm hoping to get to a place in the work formally, which just speaks to people about the energy of the human connection to the landscape. But for me, I mean, it's very much encapsulated in indigenous thought. It's very much about indigeneity and about etymology and words and names and language and native experience.
Awesome, thank you so much.
That's pretty cool. Do you guys see the dances? I don't know if that came through. Did you guys catch the dances? That's cool, right? Those are actually Rio Grande Pueblo buffaloes. Those are the kids, I think. And they have the headdresses and the buffalo horns, and there's a male-female line with the drums, and those are Tewa chanting, Tewa words.
Oh, that's awesome. I'm glad we got to see that. That's really cool, and it adds a lot to the discussion of your painting. So thank you so much for sharing that. Our next question is from Medill. Do you have an interesting acquisition story or maybe an interesting loan story? We'd love to hear that.
So it's a little like choosing among your children, because when you acquire things, you are so attached to them. But I do have one that I have a dirty little secret. I have to confess, I don't like Antiques Roadshow, but I know everyone else does. And so I have a little bit of an Antiques Roadshow style acquisition, because curators have lists of things that they want, either because they're filling gaps to, in the collection, or you're adding strength to strength. You've got a great collection of Thiebaud's, but you're missing certain parts of his body of work, that kind of thing. And then there are the sort of the real pipe dreams, which are, I know that this was made, but I don't know if it still exists. And this is particularly true for the decorative arts. So I have been working on 19th century decorative arts for quite a while, and particularly a man who was pioneering new techniques at Tiffany and Company in the latter part of the 19th century. And they had gotten a ton of press for pioneering very new ways of working with iron, and the incredibly finely worked iron that's damascened with gold and silver. So if you think of, if anybody's seen Islamic collections of armor, that kind of technique. And a really sort of intrepid dealer had found a pair of candlesticks at a basically just one up from a garage sale on the Cape. And they knew enough to recognize that they thought these were perhaps something worth looking at. And they did some research and they brought them to me. And I realized they were in fact Tiffany's first effort at doing this. And they were made for the Paris World's Fair of 1878. And then I had the task of explaining to the board that these things that sold for $25 on the Cape, I was asking to spend quite a bit more money on because I had not found them at that particular location. But that's sort of, it's always exciting to add to the collection, to be able to tell those stories to the public. But when it's something that you didn't even dare quite hope would exist, these candlesticks, they're quite diminutive. They're like 8 inches, but I would encourage people to come visit them when they're in New York. They're really extraordinary.
Thank you. And this one goes back to Mateo. I want to know, what is the most challenging piece you've ever worked on, and what makes a piece difficult?
There's a lot of pieces I could talk about. I'm a studio artist, so primarily what I do is I go into a studio and I'm alone for most of the time, and I put records on, listen to music, and paint. That's kind of the formal aspect of it, And then within that process, I build paintings which have issues in them. They have color and light logic, or brushwork, surface, just different kind of things painters talk about. The kind of the vocabulary, the syntax of painting. That's not what I find hardest, though. Some people struggle with that. I have struggled with that in the past. What I think is actually most challenging is public artwork. And we've done some murals. Maybe about 8 years ago, we did a MMIW mural at the Edge Festival in Santa Fe Indian Market. MMIW, for people that aren't following that, is Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women. And this is about 8-9 years ago, before this was really a hot topic. It's really quite prevalent on social media now. It's kind of everywhere. But 8 years ago, people weren't really talking about it. And we actually had personal experience with this in my family, my extended family. So we did MMIW murals, and they were in public space, and they were really interesting. We took photographs of women's faces that had been murdered in Canada, primarily around, I think I want to say Hull. I think it was the Red River region in Hull. And there's an area in Hull where there's so many bodies of these young Indigenous women that are being murdered, and they're dumped in the river. And the Indigenous communities go in and they actually dredge on their own. The community gets together and they go out on boats and they dredge for the bodies of their own people. And we took these, I don't know, I think at the time, like 9 years ago, there was a certain number, like they were saying there was a certain number of women that were missing. And we took a one image of each, representing something like 1,000 women. And we put a whole series of these portraits up on this wall. And then we spray painted it with red paint and some yellow, some kind of ochreish yellow, with using fire extinguishers. And then we went back in and we covered their portraits, to kind of symbolize the disappearance of them with the red. And I think it was a really interesting, powerful piece. And then women from the audience, Native women, actually came in and they started doing this tremolo. It's like a la 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 kind of sound. It's like a lulu, they call it, or tremolo, trilling, I think it is. And oftentimes plainswomen will trill at times of great emotion. It's like an ululation kind of. And they came out of the audience and they started taking the paint off the faces, and they wanted to bring these figures back up. And it just happened. It wasn't really like something that was scripted. It just became. And I thought it was really interesting stuff, this kind of excavation, the kind of covering of the faces, and then the re-excavation of the faces, and the kind of, performance aspect of it all. It's really untypical work for me as a studio artist. And that to me was, I think, really interesting and really challenging. Later, we did a MMIW mural, I think about a year ago, recently, and we were up at the Museum of Arts and Culture, and we did a similar project. Instead of using photographs of women's faces, we just painted the faces of women in and then painted on top of those. And it was more of a, I guess, kind of traditional easel approach towards large format kind of mural space. But what was interesting to me was in the second mural that the politics about MMIW became so dense. It became so difficult to do the project because there was so much interest, that Native women in the community were so feeling that they needed to claim this thing, that it was really contested. The space was sort of contested by Native women who showed up and really, questioned and interrogated us in terms of what we were trying to accomplish with the mural, what our motivations were, and really what our sincerity level was in doing this work. So it was really interesting to me, the difference in like 9 years between the first project when no one was really thinking about it, and the second project when there was this real attempt on the kind of left, this kind of academic left was really kind of attempting to claim the space around MMIW and public discourse. And that was really incredibly challenging because, you do something like this and it's a little daunting. You kind of really put yourself out. When you're doing something in the course of a day, it's really going to be all laid on the line. As a painter, and you have a large space like that, and you're going to execute a piece with other people. It's collaborative, and if there's any weakness in the work, it's going to show. If there's any strength, it's going to show. But it's a very vulnerable place for an artist to be, just to kind of go out into a public space and make something large and kind of put it out there for everyone to look at. And it's also, it had become a very critical space in the interim of 8 years, which I didn't realize. 9 years ago, this was like kind of the edge of it. And 1 year ago, this was a very central idea to a kind of, left critique of Native women, Native women's bodies and Native women's, ideological and aesthetic space and all this stuff. So I think those were, some of the more weirder, unpredictable, challenging things I'd done. It's much easier to just be in your studio and to do something, and you can edit it and you can look at it over time and you can decide what works and what doesn't work. And one of my studio art instructors at Dartmouth taught me that you don't have to show work that you don't feel comfortable with. If you don't feel that a painting or a drawing is really strong, you can just take it out of your body and you can put it in, some other space and not have to worry about that. But when you're doing public art in a community, in a space with a community that's kind of built into the space, it's much more complicated. It's exhilarating. I mean, it's a broader venue. It's very direct. It's very energizing and energetic, but it's also very complicated. It's a very nuanced space. In 8 years, it went from a space where no one was doing this stuff and talking about it to a space where every Native artist was doing this and every Native artist was talking about it, and all the artists that that I knew, there was a significant amount of them that just really felt that they had to own this thing, that they wanted their voice to be the voice on this, and that to do a public art project on MMIW now meant that you were going to be critiqued very, very, very harshly in some respects, very, very, very rugged, ruthless critique from your own people, because there was a lot of, people thought I was making money off it. People thought I was insincere. People thought I was self-promoting. But ultimately, the reason we did the second project was that we were reading the newspaper. And in that month, a year ago, Albuquerque was leading the country in murdered and missing Indigenous women cases. They had the largest number of cases of any city in America in that year. And so we were shocked, that this had gotten worse in the interim. It hadn't gotten better. It hadn't been addressed. And so really the core, motivation was we had this public space. We had the venue and we had a budget, and we felt that we wanted to talk about this more because it was shocking. You know, we're an hour away from Albuquerque and Santa Fe, and it's the leading space in the country. It's a leading town in the country that year for the number of unsolved and murdered and missing Indigenous women cases. So that was really what it was about, was just bringing attention to that and raising public consciousness around it. But the politics, you know, that surrounded the public art thing were actually exhausting. They were exhausting politics from your own community. It was, you know, from your own native art community, there was a lot of stones that were thrown. That's probably more of an answer than you wanted, right?
No, that was great. Thank you for sharing things both about the critique and issues close to home.
Okay, now we're going to move to questions from the audience. And actually, the first question is one that either Mateo or Medill or both of you can chime in on. It's asking about both the artist and the curator perspective on this. So the question is, how can we improve the ways we present Indigenous art? How can we, as natives or non-natives, work to make sure that we are respecting Indigenous history, culture, traditions, etc.? So either one of you can chime in first.
Mateo, you want to start?
I could, but I've been talking so much. I just wanted to give you a chance to step in first. Do you want to step in?
So I can't speak to this from a lot of direct experience in that it's not in my curatorial purview, but it's something that the Met is and the American wing where I work is very much engaged in exploring right now. And we have a whole series of panels where we're having conversations about should Native art be shown in the context of quote unquote art, you know, encyclopedic art museums? Where is it shown historically at the Met? It was shown in the sort of what they called AAOA, which was the Arts of Africa, Oceania, and the Americas. And we, a collector of historic Native art, gave their collection with the proviso that it be shown in the American wing. And we just hired the first curator of Native American art, and she's really engaged with thinking about our historic collections and rendering it relevant and in dialogue with not only contemporary artists like Mateo, but really thinking about the ways in which sort of Euro-Western white American traditions think about objects and the kinds of life and meaning and resonance that they have for living communities, and do we create spaces where objects can continue to have spiritual lives? And we've had various members of the tribes from which these objects originally came talk about, like, my use of the word object. They don't like the word object, but nobody can come up with what the right word is, and to think of these as part of living cultures, and thinking about, when Mateo, you were talking about language, thinking about language in terms of Native languages becoming part of our labeling. That's something I hadn't really gotten into, but the challenge of the sort of tyranny of a 4-inch by 4-inch label, and what you can and can't say, and in terms of what you can fit, and trying to push our institution to really think very differently about how we can bring in a much richer and more nuanced kinds of dialogues and lives for these objects. So with that, I think Mateo will have more interesting things to say on this subject.
So you're talking about the Dyker Collection? Is that the Dyker at the Met?
Yeah, so the Dyker Collection is what sort of started all of this, and I know we don't know what we're doing yet. I mean, it's all.
I met the Dyker guy. He really didn't want to talk to me too much, but he snubbed me. I was in the Dyker Pavilion at NMAI doing their art market, and I was introduced to him. And he kind of just walked over. but I salute what he did. You know, I unfortunately, he didn't dig me, so I'm not in the Dyker Collection. I didn't wind up in the Met. My brother's in the Met, Diego Romero, Potter. My sister-in-law, Cara Romero, is in the Met. I think Diego Romero was in the Met before the Dyker stuff happened. So there's this major shift with the Dyker stuff. It's actually a kind of breath of fresh air in many respects. It's problematic in other respects, but I think if you're a contemporary Native artist, you know, I've been doing this probably about 30 years. And for the last 20 years, when I was really listening, Native artists have been really complaining that they've been ghettoized. They've been saying, you know, we want to be in the major institutions. We want to be considered as artists. We want to be covered by Art in America, for instance. They you know, they seem to really have these ideas that, you know, to be in the DIA Foundation is the most important thing for them in some respects. It's an interesting idea that they've been ghettoized. I would say that there is some truth to that from the perspective of working in the field, the contemporary field. I think there has been a ghettoization to an extent. One of the reasons I do landscape, expressionist landscape painting, is because it's considered in some ways American painting, right? So if you're doing something like more romantic or more regional, in Santa Fe, for instance, I mean, there's so many examples of painters here, Native and non, that are doing, you know, Tao school painting, for instance. They're doing Victor Higgins again, or they're doing like these Blumshine paintings. They're doing these paintings in the vernacular and style of people that have been dead for over 100 years, and they're kind of putting it forward as material now, which is kind of interesting to me, but puzzling in some respects. I wonder what the connections are. So these ideas, you know, what constitutes American art, what constitutes fine art, what constitutes craft, what constitutes decorative arts, what constitutes arts which men have historically done in Native communities, what constitutes art forms and aesthetics that women have done traditionally in Native communities. There's a break between, you know, women traditionally have, you know, with Julian Maria Martinez and San Alfonso, you see the women make the pots and the men paint the pots, for instance. That's not a, you know, a hard and fast rule with the black on black, but it's kind of an idea. It's an aesthetic, I guess. I don't necessarily have all the answers to it. I think it's interesting now. I know my brother Diego Romero was in the Met before Dyker's stuff came out, and I thought that was really interesting. It was, you know, 15 years ago, it was groundbreaking to go into the Met and you saw maybe 2 living Native artists in there, and my brother was one of them, and that was really kind of, you know, it was exaltation. It was kind of like, wow, like that's a glass ceiling. Another idea is that I think Kent Monkman recently has placed work in the Met, and that's, I think, irrespective of the Dyker connection. I think they just
that was a separate. But I think without the Dyker Collection being at the Met, Kent Monkman probably wouldn't have been interested in doing his work, and so it becomes, as we have these meetings and we bring in, there were a bunch of scholars about a week ago debating just this, you know, are you ghettoizing, or are you sort of failing to respect the important sort of independent narratives if you include it? And so the American Ring at the Met right now is really trying to totally reconsider what American art is.
I take my hat off to that. Yeah, I if I was wearing a hat, I would tip it. I'd be like, thank you. You know, that's.
But I think we'll stumble more than we succeed probably in the beginning, because it is, as many different people as have sort of engaged in talking about this, there are that many different opinions, and I think sometimes you have to be willing to get started, and credit to the Dykers for giving us the collection, which gets us started and makes us aware of how much we don't know about how to exhibit this. And for any of you who are Canadian on this call, in terms of museum practice, the Canadian museums have been having these discussions and thinking about this a lot longer than a lot of the museums in North America. So there's some really interesting lessons to learn. Sometimes it's learning what not to do. But I think, and I know you all have an installation right now at the hood of Courtney Leonard's work. Is that right? And the Met just acquired a couple of Courtney Leonard's pieces that we're going to show in conjunction with the Dyker historical material. So.
Well, I loved hearing both of your thoughts on that, and I'm glad there was a lot of overlap there, so we could have kind of more of a conversation. I think maybe we have time for 2 more questions. So the next question is for Medill, and it's just, what advice would you give an aspiring art curator? And that could be specific to the decorative arts or art curating in general.
Well, I mean, the field of decorative arts is so minute. I will try to be a little more general, because I would love to convert a few people to the field of decorative arts, and yet it is a small but mighty field. In terms of working as a curator, I think with many careers, it's what happens on the way to where you think you're going that all the interesting things happen. So being open and sort of willing to take whatever sort of surprising opportunities come your way is important. Getting a PhD is part of that process. When I finished at Dartmouth, I wasn't sure what I wanted to get my PhD in, which is what led me to take a year in England, which is what sent me off on this entirely different tangent. But I think thinking about what really interests you before you dive into a PhD is also important. I think the schism between academia and museums can be more pronounced in some fields than others. But if one is interested in museum work, I think there are a lot of academic institutions that really support that interest and will get you where you want to go. When I look at the fellowships that I have reviewed for the Met, almost everybody wants to do modern and contemporary, which is great, but I would also encourage people to think broadly about the fact that you can engage with very contemporary and important issues and contemporary themes with historical material as well. And my last bit of advice is, you often learn the most at a small institution where you can wear a lot of hats. I've spent my career at a very big one, which makes me pretty much unemployable anywhere else, and which is okay. But I think early in one's career, the more different opportunities you have, the more opportunity you have to really think critically about what you want your life as a curator to look like.
Okay, thank you so much. And I think we actually have to move on to the final question now. But before I pose that, I just wanted to remind you all to please fill out a survey for the event, which you can find in the chat. It's just a little bit of feedback. But this final question is a little broad, so I want to give you guys both some time to answer it. So it is, how do you see the art world changing going forward? And how do you think the next generation of artists and art professionals fit into that changing landscape? So maybe Matteo, you can go first and share your thoughts on
that. I think there's a movement towards digital. I think that I'm an analog drawer. I draw and I paint. I come out of a tradition of people that are studio art. My brother's a potter. My father was a Dunn School painter in Santa Fe in the 60s, kind of ethnographic watercolor on illustration board. So I was born out of an analog sensibility, and that's what I respond to. But I see, especially with the pandemic, as things have art exhibition and venue and openings have all kind of closed up, and everything is being conducted online. So there's a really strong digital videographic kind of presence of everything. And I see the art actually moving in that direction. I'm looking at, these ideas of digital painting now, which I don't really know what that is. I mean, I'm not sure that I understand the term digital painting, but I'm seeing that showing up a lot. And I'm looking at, it might have been Urs Fischer or something. There's these contemporary artists that are actually doing work now, prints, digital prints, which exist only digitally. There's not actually a physical object. They're just designing things almost like digital trading cards. And I know some people in New York that run the Topps trading card stuff, and they said they went from physical analog cards to cards that are displayed on phones. So your kid shows up at school with a cell phone, and he shows somebody that there's a digital card collection embedded in the cell phone or carried in the cell phone. So I just see that. I see that this is a time of sort of ubiquitous, promiscuous information about everything. Every time I get on social media, I get a headache, and some of it's quite remarkable and some of it's really terrible. And there's so much information, coming at me all the time. I've encouraged it. I'm on Instagram, and I follow these things. I look at TikTok every once in a while. And because I exhibit, contemporary now, I'm exhibiting currently, everything's happening on these platforms. And I just see that there is, I guess a movement with the flow of information, with the flow of information and the speed of the information and the kind of ubiquitousness of the information. I see that art, it takes these technologies, and it takes these medium, it's this new medium. It's this kind of, virtual art medium. It could be videographic, it could be performance that's been filmed, it could be, art paintings that don't physically exist, but they're existing in some kind of, moderated space, some internet space, some digital space. And I kind of see it, that's the direction where things are going to. It doesn't just warm me, because I'm a person that grew up, drawing with a piece of charcoal and mixing colors on a palette. Very, very kind of, old kind of, classical easel painting kind of thing with Ben Moss, for instance, as one of my Dartmouth instructors. So I'm actually interested in a world that's very tactile and very sensual and very physical. And I'm not of the generation of kids that grew up with a cell phone that were really media addicted. All my kids are almost exclusively media addicted kids. They're boys for the most part. I have one daughter. She's a Dartmouth alum. But the boys are all just on the phone, right here. Everything's right here. And so I see that with that kind of attention from people being focused on that space, this digital space, I just think, how can the art not go in that direction? I don't think it means that people will stop painting or making pots, for instance, or stop doing beadwork, but I think that you'll see more of this field emerge, more people get involved in the field, younger people going in that direction. It segues with the skill sets and the worldviews and ideologies of younger people.
Yeah, it's interesting. I wouldn't have thought of all of that, but
I don't like it, actually. It's not my cup of tea. I sorry to interrupt you, but it's not my cup of tea. It leaves me kind of cold, but I just see it as being inevitable. You can like it or not like it, but it's going to happen whether you want it to or not. It's like
I think to a certain extent it'll be both and. When you look at the people who come into the Met right now amidst the pandemic with their masks on, there is a real desire for some of that sort of tactile, more analog art. But I think the Met has realized that we can reach audiences that we have never reached as successfully. So I think our programming and our thinking will also be digital. And I'm mindful it's 6:01, so I know you all need to wrap up. But I think in Mateo's comments, there are some truths for what exhibitions and museum work look like. I think there will be digital components. And if you had asked me a year ago, would we be able to do exhibition openings, et cetera, digitally, I would have looked at you like you were a little bit mad. And we not only are we doing it because we need to right now, but we're finding that audiences around the world can participate in ways that weren't possible before. But I do think people will still gravitate towards work like Mateo's and work that is 3D and in the flesh as well.
Well, thank you both for that answer. It's definitely a lot to think about as we leave the panel, but we would like to thank you both for taking the time to so thoughtfully answer our questions, and you definitely provided valuable guidance to those who are interested in the arts. So thank you to our wonderful audience as well for the engaging questions at the end. And as a reminder, there will be a recording posted on the Hood social media. So in case you didn't get the survey in the chat, we'll also be emailing it out tomorrow. And we definitely appreciate the feedback on the program. Sorry, Matteo, was there one more thing you wanted to say?
I had a shameless plug for myself with the curator. Is it Medill? Is that your name?
Yep.
Medill. Yeah, put a piece of mine in your collection if you can. Everyone I know got in with the Dyker thing, but Matteo. So Matteo's just going to shamelessly plug himself and say that.
Patricia Norby is in charge of that. I will convey your plug. And I noticed in the chat some people were asking to see paintings in your studio. And if you go back and watch the recording, I think that early when Matteo walked us around was recorded, so people can go back and see it.
Yes, that's a good point. You can definitely check that out when the recording is posted. But any last thoughts? Okay, well, thank you all for coming, and we especially thank you all for being our panelists tonight. So have a good evening, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye, thanks a lot.